The coronavirus has us all on the edge. That is precisely why, on this occasion, we want to tell you how one country is beating coronavirus. Well, let's get straight to the point, shall we? Now that SARS coronavirus 2, which disease caused by it is called COVID-19, has begun to spread widely throughout Europe and also through North America, the sense of alarm has multiplied faster than Krispy Kreme churns out donuts. At the time of making this video, the virus had already infected more than 120,000 people worldwide, of which just 80,000 cases were confirmed in China. However, the infection hotspots are no longer limited to Asia, but they're spread throughout the whole world. Italy, Spain, Iran, France, and the United States are just a few examples on a long list that is adding countries and hotspots by the day. In a short time, those infected in the rest of the world will far outweigh the current confirmed cases in China. With everything going on, the most shocking and the most surprising thing about this crisis is how it has been handled in the different countries. In the West, for example, when this whole story only affected China, it was said that we were facing a killer virus. Then, when cases started to be recorded in the rest of the world, it suddenly turned into a simple flu. And finally, after the number of infections spread, it became a dangerous virus again. Take the example of Italy, where we saw that people developed very serious symptoms, and that many of the patients required hospitalization, and that hospitals were beginning to collapse under the pressure caused by the COVID-19 disease. Suddenly, the danger was very tangible, a rapidly spreading virus capable of causing serious problems for multiple health systems. And that's without getting into the potential economic damage. Overnight, the threat became real and imminent. The problem is that for a long time, no action was taken. Spain's a good illustration of this. As infections were already reaching the hundreds, mass demonstrations and political and sporting events continued to take place.
No le recomiendo a nadie nada relacionado con la manifestación. Yo creo que cada uno tiene que expresar sus ideas como considere y que si considera que tiene que estar en una manifestación, que se den. Si considera que no tiene que estar, que no se den. Si mi hijo me pregunta si puede ir, le voy a decir que haga lo que quiera.
However, in the case of China, it was quite the opposite. The Chinese government rapidly put into place radical measures to curb the epidemic. They decreed virtually absolute isolation and quarantine throughout Hubei, the province whose capital is Wuhan. As you all know, Wuhan is presumed to be the source of the epidemic. Well, at the time, all the measures taken by the Chinese government were labeled by many Western media outlets as exaggerated, alarmist, and even medieval. However, it seems that we can already say that it has been a success. At the time of preparing this video, China is hardly reporting any new positive cases. Look at this.
Coronavirus. China says disease curbed in Wuhan and Hubei. BBC.
Yes, it seems that China has managed to defeat the virus, but the question that many ask themselves is, at what price? The Chinese government not only confined 60 million people to their homes under threat of heavy fines, but also stopped much of its economy and production. Factories, shopping centers, banks, everything. You think I'm exaggerating? In this case, look at the PMI index, an indicator that is based on the orders that companies place with suppliers and which is used to measure the situation of economic activity in a country. Figures below 50 on this index indicate recession. In the case of Chinese industry, the February PMI was 35.7, a level well below 50, and for you to get an idea of just how dire this really was, it's the lowest level ever recorded for China since the index was created. Lower even than during the lowest point during the 2008 crisis. And in the case of services, it was no better. China practically had no productivity at all. And the question that comes up is, will Western governments be willing to go that far? Look, we're talking about a huge looming crisis. Is there no better way to deal with the coronavirus? Well, right here is where we're going to open your eyes to different possibilities. But there is one that really stands out, and we think it will surprise you. Take a look at this.
It's all about timing and tactics.
In short, there are only 3 ways to deal with a coronavirus. The first start by doing nothing, then practically nothing, and then end up doing everything too late, which is basically the strategy that countries like Spain and the United States seem to have taken.
The virus that we're talking about having to do, a lot of people think that goes away in April with the heat. Because of all we've done, the risk to the American people remains very low. It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle, it will disappear.
The second possibility is what China did: lock up the population and cripple the entire country. And the third, try to reach a middle ground between two possibilities, a midpoint that is effective, of course. We know that making a choice is not easy, so in this video we want to talk to you about a country that has taken the third path and that seems to have been successful. We're talking about South Korea. Have a look at this chart. After reporting nearly 1,000 new confirmed cases per day over several days, the figure soon dropped to just over 100. With this trend, we will very soon be able to see the recovery rate becoming greater than the new cases, which implies that the epidemic peak, that is, the number of total active cases, will begin to decrease. In other words, at the time of making this video, everything points to South Korea winning the war against the coronavirus. That is, of course, if things are still under control. You know that with these things you always have to be very cautious, because you'll never know when a problematic new outbreak may arise. But now, with all the data at our disposal, the burning question is, how has South Korea achieved such good results in just a matter of days? South Korea is a country that is geographically and socially very interconnected with China. For example, every day it has dozens of daily flights to and from the country where the epidemic originated. That is why it established extraordinary measures at airports as soon as the epidemic was confirmed. The government arranged separate boarding gates and arrival routes for passengers from China and immediately banned all flights to and from Hubei province. In addition, body temperature readings that had been done routinely were increased and became much more thorough. And not only that, all affected public spaces also began to be disinfected more regularly. Remember, all this was done before there was a single coronavirus case in the country, just as a precautionary measure. So the big question is, if they did all of this before anyone got sick, what the hell did they do when they detected the first cases? What strategy did the government follow? And is it a plan that other countries could follow as well? Well, let's take a look.
Coronavirus in South Korea, an arduous battle.
When you already have the coronavirus in your country, there is one essential thing that you have to do as quickly as possible: identify the source of the infection. To achieve this, a thorough investigation into where the infected people were, what contact they had with others, and how the first patient could have been infected needs to be done. Well, in the case of South Korea, the first big outbreak was confirmed in the city of Daegu, a city about 2.5 million inhabitants in the southeast of the country. Quickly, in less than 2 days, South Korean public health authorities had already identified patient zero of the outbreak, a female member of a religious sect. Unfortunately, the woman had been in contact with at least 1,000 people at 2 different religious events. That's how it's believed that the spread of the coronavirus in Daegu began. So, after a thorough analysis of the background of this positive case, what do you think the next step was? Well, basically, the government forced the sect to hand over the full list of its members. It was vital to isolate people who may have been infected and take action in at-risk areas as soon as possible. During the early days, the sect refused to cooperate with authorities and even instructed their members to lie. It was a race against the clock, and every minute counted. The government made an administrative investigation and finally got the membership list. It turned out that there were more than 100,000 people on that list. So the next step that was rapidly implemented was mass testing. The more than 100,000 members of the sect began to be tested one by one, even if they were not presenting symptoms of any kind. You have to understand, South Korea started to run coronavirus tests as if there was no tomorrow. They made all their laboratories available to process the tests and introduced a very streamlined network for testing. A very peculiar network, actually. For example, a curious way of carrying out the process was developed. That's drive-through centers. Something similar to going to a McDonald's drive-through, except you get a coronavirus test in just over 10 minutes.
South Korea is using fast food-style drive-thrus to test for coronavirus. CBS News.
Yep, that's right, and it's pretty impressive. South Korea has set up centers where you arrive in your own car and without even getting out of the vehicle, you get tested for coronavirus. Then the results are available within a few hours. If you are positive, you are advised immediately and put into isolation and appropriate treatment begins. This swift response has a dual benefit. Firstly, it curbs infection rates, and secondly, it allows monitoring in the early stages to help prevent symptoms escalating. It seems like a pretty great idea, and it's honestly a surprise that this hasn't been copied by other affected countries such as Spain or the USA. In such cases, forward planning and action as quickly as possible is essential. The fundamental thing about such centers is that the South Korean government understood from the outset that the only way to win the race against the virus was to detect people before they could spread infection. And this is precisely why South Korea is the country that has carried out the most coronavirus tests per million people. Take a look at this. And the truth is that it seems completely logical that all countries of the world take measures like this when we're talking about epidemic risk. After all, the biggest problem with coronavirus is that it's highly contagious, which can cause the number of cases to increase very quickly, putting hospitals and health infrastructure under severe pressure. That is precisely what is happening right now in Italy. And to avoid getting to that point, another of the South Korean government's initiatives in their war against the coronavirus has been the use of mobile apps. During this epidemic crisis, coronavirus applications have become popular in South Korea. Incredibly, these apps pinpoint exactly when and where cases are confirmed and give information such as age and gender, as well as places known to have been visited by the patient.
Coronavirus mobile apps are surging in popularity in South Korea. CNN Business.
That way, just by using simple technology on their phones, Koreans can avoid potential infection hotspots. Now, it's true that this can clash a little with data protection, and that opens up a huge can of worms. In cases of national emergency, should our data be available for large-scale use? Should our geolocation records be able to be shared with these types of applications, for example? These are questions that we leave open to you. In any case, what is certain is that between preventing the spread of infection and delivering rapid diagnoses, Korea has set a record that so far has no competition in the world and has curbed the mortality rate of the virus.
South Korea has tested 140,000 people for coronavirus. That could explain why its death rate is just 0.6%, far lower than in China or the United States. Business Insider.
But wait a minute, something tells me that many of you have got to be wondering, but Simon, are you sure they didn't do anything else apart from that? Were they really able to contain the virus with just these few measures? Well, the truth is, no. There were many more measures, and among them, perhaps the most basic one was also the most important. Can you imagine which one this was? Well, listen up.
Parece que la epidemia tiene posibilidades de empezar a remitir. Nosotros creemos que España no va a tener, como mucho, más allá de algún caso diagnosticado. Esperemos que no haya transmisión local. Si la hay, será transmisión muy limitada y muy controlada.
The value of the truth.
Here's a question for you. Where do you think the line is between telling the truth, encouraging panic, and hiding facts, or even lying to people? And careful, because it's not an easy question for a government to answer when it comes to dealing with such a large-scale crisis. When the situation threatens to get out of hand, governments have to choose. Either tell the truth, even at the risk of people panicking and unleashing chaos, or lie and obscure reality by giving a false sense of security. It seems that Spain chose the second option, although that's something we'll talk about in a future video. Meanwhile, South Korea took a risk and chose to tell the truth and be transparent. From the beginning, the government took the virus very seriously. That may be because not so long ago in 2015, the country was shaken by another coronavirus strain, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS. MERS is much more deadly than COVID-19, as it has a fatality rate of 34%. That makes it roughly 10 times more deadly than the currently circulating coronavirus. In In a way, you could say that MERS gave South Korea an advantage. They had a recent experience with an epidemic and they learned from their mistakes. And they learned that something fundamental in this type of situation is to be transparent with the public and treat people like adults. Tell the truth and give clear directions. Look, of the nearly 8,000 cases recorded at the time of making this video, almost 5,800 are in Daegu, you know, the city where it all originated in South Korea. Or in other words, 3 weeks after the first case was confirmed, 75% of cases are still contained in the city where the original case was located. Think about that for a moment. Isn't that quite a success, considering that the city had not been quarantined, nor transport suspended, or anything like that? How has Korea managed to contain cases in a single city without being heavy-handed like China was with Wuhan? Well, there's a lot to take in here, but the moral of the story seems to be to tell the truth. Being transparent with citizens early on made South Koreans aware of the severity of the virus and the looming situation. And of course, when you have an idea of the dangers, you're in a much better position to react to them appropriately to prevent the danger spreading. Armed with clear information, South Koreans stopped leaving home unless it was essential. They cancelled social engagements, adapted their working hours, worked from home, and in some cases were given temporary leave from their jobs. The streets of South Korea, its shopping centers, its parks and gardens, everything, absolutely everything, emptied overnight. Life, the joy that often characterizes this country, suddenly seems to have been dialed down to 25% of the normal. And the question we have to think about is, isn't it worth having a couple of boring weeks at home if it means beating an epidemic and sidestepping mass panic? South Korea serves as an example at both levels, both in the reaction of the government and public health authorities, and in the reaction of the citizens who have demonstrated a very high level of civic responsibility. Now it comes to the crunch. Do you think that the South Korean model would work in your country to combat COVID-19? Do you think that your country has time to implement these measures? How do you think your friends and family would act if they had to make so many sacrifices? Well, leave your answer in the comments below, and I really do hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, please do check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. And as always, thank you for watching.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.